If you ask an economist why some nations are wealthy while others remain trapped in poverty, the answer usually comes down to one word: institutions. The prevailing theory suggests that countries with inclusive institutions, defined by free markets and property rights, thrive, while those with extractive institutions, involving state intervention, fail. This theory is the standard for global finance, and it was recently validated by the highest authority in the field. In 2024, the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded specifically to researchers who formalized this worldview. The primary architect of this framework is MIT economist Daron Acemoglu. His work provides the mathematical foundation for how policymakers approach global development. Tracing the data and assumptions behind these models reveals a highly engineered product assembled on a global epistemic production line. To understand the reality of global poverty, we have to look past the math and investigate the origins of this dogma and the specific impact it has on the governing power of developing nations. The components of this ideology were first assembled after the Second World War. By 1947, welfare states were expanding, and governments were increasingly regulating their economies to provide social security. For those managing global private capital, this shift represented a significant threat to their interests. In response, Friedrich Hayek organized an intellectual counteroffensive, forming the Mont Pelerin Society. Their premise: state planning leads to tyranny. Freedom required shifting economic power from the state to private actors. They viewed democratic control as a barrier to property rights. In this model, the state's power is chained to ensure the market remains the primary authority. Philosophy alone, however, cannot change the policy of a sovereign state. To force compliance, this ideological framework had to be transformed into a bureaucratic tool. This transformation occurred during the financial crises of the 1980s and 90s. Global institutions used sovereign debt collapses to require developing nations to implement radical structural adjustments. To enforce these rules, the World Bank and IMF established metric systems, scoring countries on their governance and creating risk indices that determine their access to international credit. These metrics have a specific bias. A nation earns a high regulatory quality score only by avoiding market intervention. If a state attempts to direct its economy, its score drops. A nation nationalizing natural resources is scored as high risk, effectively penalizing public ownership. These metrics act as a mechanism that translates anti-state ideology into standardized, objective-looking data. This data is then sent to elite universities to be integrated into the standard economic literature used by global policymakers. Acemoglu's regression model used historical settler mortality rates to argue that inherited institutional quality drives modern wealth. But critics note this relied on flawed records and overlooked how historical disease directly affected agriculture and human capital, bypassing the institutional variable entirely. There is also a historical gap in the Acemoglu doctrine. It classifies nations like the US and Australia as having inclusive institutions that protect property, yet it does not account for the fact that this property was secured through the displacement of indigenous populations. The complex math serves as a technical layer, providing a formal basis for a specific geopolitical worldview. This creates a self-verifying cycle. Think tanks develop the ideological framework, the World Bank generates the data, elite universities provide the mathematical proof, and global capital enforces the results. By framing poverty as the result of local institutional failure, this system shifts the focus away from a history of colonial resource extraction and unequal trade. The math frames poverty entirely as an internal issue, a consequence of local choices rather than global positioning. This logic implies the only available path to development is the surrender of remaining economic sovereignty. The push for good institutions often functions as an architecture of surrender. Achieving true economic literacy requires looking past the equations and examining the factory that built them.